Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's final session, all about sensory experiences and processing. So my name's Alice. I'm the Corporate Partnerships Officer here at Autistica, and I'm going to be hosting today's final session. So, as you know, it's last session today titled Sensory Experiences and Processing, which we know are both integral parts of many autistic people's lives. As such, everyday environments and activities can have a significant or unanticipated impact and may require appropriate adaptations or support for autistic people. Such experiences and issues will be the focus of this stream, looking also to approaches and programmes aimed at developing more accessible spaces and places. We're welcoming two brilliant presenters to this session, Keren MacLennan with Emily from @21 and Sensory podcast, Cheryl Gascoigne and Tackley, whose bios you can read just below this live stream, along with a PDF version of their slides if you wish to see them in a different format. All our presenters will be joining us for the live Q&A at the end of this session once their presentations are finished. Please remember you can submit your questions via the Q&A system just below this video. These will be collated by my lovely Autistica colleagues and we'll try and get to as many of your questions as we can. Some of our presenters have agreed to let us share their email addresses with you as well if you have any further questions, and we'll put those in the Q&A system after the whole panel session has ended. So over now to our first presentation. So Keren and Emily, please take it away.
Hello and welcome to our presentation on Sensory Street. We will be discussing the sensory experiences of autistic people in public places.
This talk today will be delivered by two members of the Sensory Street research team. I'm Dr. Keren MacLennan and I'm currently working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Reading. I'm a non-autistic autism researcher and I primarily study sensory reactivity and mental health.
My name is Emily and I'm an illustrator, graphic designer and podcaster, creating work online at 21 and Sensory across social media. I am a research assistant on the Sensory Street project. I have sensory processing disorder, which I was diagnosed with age 8, and I am autistic, diagnosed age 25. Now I'm going to talk about the background to our research. While members of the autism community are all too aware of the importance of sensory processing differences, people without autism-specific training or expertise may be unaware of the effects that sensory processing differences have on everyday life. Sensory processing differences are part of what makes the world disabling for autistic people and can impact family life, education, and mental health. For example, on the right, my illustration shows the enabling and disabling elements when it comes to sight and visual processing. Some visual input can bring real joy, whereas others can be really overwhelming and disorientating. The sensory environment can make it difficult for myself and other autistic individuals to access public spaces. Literary accounts have highlighted experiences of being excluded and made to feel uncomfortable in spaces, and qualitative research has shown that certain places are overwhelming and so avoided by autistic people, such as large shops, hospitals, and cinemas. But so far, there has been minimal research examining the autistic experience of sensory environments, particularly related to public places.
So the first aim of our research was to examine the types of public places that autistic adults experience as either disabling or enabling due to the sensory environment. Second, we wanted to identify principles that underlie whether sensory environments are experienced as disabling or enabling. And third, we wanted to examine how these principles are reflected in the public places that autistic adults commonly find to be disabling.
It's very important to create awareness of sensory processing difficulties, as they are a key part of what makes the world quite a disabling and uninviting place for autistic people.
We conducted a qualitative research study that was co-produced with members of the autistic community, and we conducted a series of online focus groups that allowed individuals to communicate using typed or spoken language. We recruited 24 autistic adults aged between 18 and 44. They were predominantly female, and they also reported to have a wide range of mental health conditions, with the most prominent being anxiety and depression. Firstly, we conducted content analysis, whereby you create categories of words or phrases that share meaning. And from this, we were able to identify common environments that autistic adults experience as disabling or enabling.
The top 6 disabling sensory environments we found were supermarkets, high street/centres, retail shops/centres, public transport, eateries, and healthcare settings. One of our participants said, "My local supermarket. I've gone there for like 7 years and they've never changed the layout. A couple of weeks ago, they completely changed the layout. And I went in and I just walked straight out. There's all the things, sensory things in a supermarket, the noises, the air conditioning, the cold fridges, but you can manage that when you know what's coming and it's easier."
The most commonly identified enabling sensory environments were stadiums, retail shops, cinemas and theatres, live music venues or clubs, museums, and outdoor spaces.
Another participant said, "I love going to bookshops. They tend to be quite quiet, and particularly ones where the shelves are all quite spaced out from each other, so you're not kind of crammed in against other people."
We then conducted reflexive thematic analysis, whereby you develop themes and sub-themes from trends in the data. From this, we were able to identify principles that underlie whether sensory environments were experienced as disabling or enabling. Through this analysis, we developed 6 main themes with 15 sub-themes. Informed by the data, as well as feedback from the autistic community, we've represented these themes as an interconnected web, which was expertly designed by Emily. The outer edge of the web represents the more disabling end of the dimension, whereas closer to the centre of the web represents the more enabling end.
A participant said, "It's like a multitude of things. I always envisage it as a big spiderweb of things that might affect me in a sensory environment. It's about actually looking at all those little things that build up, being able to reduce those little things as well."
The first principle we developed was related to the sensory landscape, or what we've called the sensory scape. Disabling environments were often talked about as having high sensory burdens, such as multisensory input or very aversive sensory input. But also, this input is often sustained and inescapable, and individuals have very little control over the sensory input. The second principle was space. Disabling environments were often talked about as being busy and crowded, but also that they often had quite confined built environments. For example, supermarkets having quite high, narrow aisles. The third principle was related to predictability. Disabling environments were often talked about as having a lack of available information to be able to plan, as well as them being inconsistent and unfamiliar, and often they presented with a lot of uncertainty.
Understanding. Throughout our focus groups, people reported that staff in public places lacked knowledge of sensory processing differences and autism. This led to individuals facing misunderstanding, judgment, and stigma from staff and members of the public. Adjustments. People in our focus groups identified that the lack of suitable adjustments can make places with challenging sensory environments more inaccessible. They described the importance of enabling an individual's communication needs and preferences, and being able to reduce the pressure and pace of interactions. Recovery. Across our focus groups, people identified the importance of having time to recover from more challenging sensory environments. This included being able to take breaks away from overwhelming sensory input to recover and prepare, and the need for designated spaces in public places to escape from sensory input.
Throughout this project, we also engaged with the autistic community on our social media channels. We analysed the responses to a series of posts asking very similar questions to our focus groups. We found a lot of similarities in the places that were reported to be disabling and enabling for autistic people, but also many of the principles were represented in people's responses to our posts.
Our work communicates how and why certain sensory environments are disabling or enabling for autistic individuals. The result can inform improvements to public places to make them more enabling and accessible, design standards and policy change.
If you would like to learn more about our project, you can visit our website at sensorystreet.uk. You can also scan the QR code to read the preprint of our research. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter at Sensory Street.
If you'd like to find out a bit more about me, I host and run the 21 and Sensory podcast. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you usually get your podcasts, and I chat to neurodiverse people from all walks of life, including some fab authors, actors, influencers, artists, and speakers, to name a few. I also enjoy discussing and drawing about my life as a sensory being across social media at 21 and Sensory.
We would like to finish by giving a shout out to the wider Sensory Street project team, including Kathy Manning, the principal investigator, as well as Becky, Catherine, Brett, Jess, and Ravine. We would also like to thank everybody who has given feedback on this project, and also the participants and people who engaged with our social media. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to your questions in the panel discussion.
Thank you both so much, Keren and Emily. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. Just amazing to hear more about public places that autistic people, specifically autistic adults, can find disabling and enabling. So I've certainly learned a lot from that. So next up, I misspoke earlier, we don't have 2 but 4 wonderful speakers in today's final session. So we're now going to move on to the wonderful Cheryl. Over to you, Cheryl.
Hello, my name is Cheryl Gascoigne and I'm from Newcastle upon Tyne Hospitals. Thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to share with you today the Sensational Thinking project. The Sensational Thinking project was created back in 2018. The rationale for this project was based upon an increased number of referrals to our community children's occupational therapy team for children who had a recent diagnosis of autism or for children experiencing sensory processing difficulties. The occupational therapy team in the community would see these children and assess these children to identify what their functional difficulties are. They would conduct standardised assessments, they would visit the children at home or in school, and they would report upon all of their findings. They would carry out their interventions and they would write a thorough report. Despite this work and despite the reports, increasing numbers of parents were coming back to us saying that other people within the community didn't understand the impact of sensory processing upon function. In order to help with that, what we were doing as a team was we created some key stakeholder training packages. And those training packages were delivered to the families of these children. These packages were also delivered to schools and also to staff within the hospitals. This was really well received and we managed to deliver it to over 75% of the schools in Newcastle. However, this was before COVID. In doing this, we also empowered those caring for children to understand their child's sensory processing difficulties. And most importantly, they could then share that information with other people who were maybe caring for their children in order to give their parents a respite as well. Ultimately, it improved the outcomes from a health perspective for these children because, as we all know, there are significant health inequalities for children who have a diagnosis of autism. After COVID, and during COVID, the Sensational Thinking project really struggled to continue, basically because we couldn't go out into the schools and see the children within a group setting, and so that became quite a tricky situation. However, last year, back in 2021, our Sensational Thinking project was very fortunate to receive funding from NHS England and NHS Improvement. that funding wasn't so much to look at the community side of things, it was very much to look at the impact that the hospital environment has upon children. Without question, children who experience sensory processing difficulties find the hospital a very challenging environment. In order to fully understand this experience and the challenges that they are experiencing, we within the project have liaised with the Children and Young Persons Advisory Group, that's CYPAG, and also the Patient Experience Team to find out more information about any complaints that we've had, but also to hear from the children themselves about experiences they and their families have had within our hospital. We've gathered more information from key stakeholders, so that includes families, but that also includes extended members of the child's family. It may be carers, but it also includes other members of staff. A lot of hospital staff have come to us and felt that they often don't know how to manage sensory processing difficulties, and sometimes being able to conduct certain investigations or assessments with these children can be challenging, and so we've got more information from them as to what they think might work or explore some of the difficulties that they're experiencing. I myself have been under every ward within Newcastle hospitals that is for children, and I've looked at each individual patient group, because a lot of our children within the hospital that have, say for instance, physical disabilities and neurological conditions, or have a long-term vent, they can also have a diagnosis of autism or sensory processing differences as well. So I've been on every single ward to look at each individual child and each individual condition, and very importantly each individual environment, because there is no getting away from the importance of understanding how each individual environment impacts upon each individual. And we always remember that each individual is exactly that, an individual, and no one solution will be appropriate for everyone. We've also created a survey to collate public and patient-based experiences of the impact that our hospital has upon them, and we have sent that out to Skills for People, and they're helping us with that collation of information. But if I'm completely honest, the richest of information that we have gathered has come directly from the people that we have spoken to. So the journey so far within the Sensational Thinking project to date. We have created with Team Evie sensory bags, and they are sensory bags to help develop children's sensory processing differences, but they are also for children who are newborn who may go on to develop sensory processing differences. So these are also a reactive resource, but also a preventative resource. We have gone on to further develop our comprehensive training packages, which is now CPD accredited for our staff group. And we've assessed every paediatric ward and our outpatient areas, and that includes the external play area as well, which we're looking to redevelop. We've also implemented ward-based and cross-ward sensory programs, and that includes the LTV, which is long-term vent, Ward 3, which is our bone marrow transplant ward, and also our oncology ward, which includes children with a diagnosis of leukemia or cancer. And we're offering those the opportunity, should they wish to be within a group, to practice their sensory processing experiences and have a really immersive experience should they wish to and should they feel confident to. And that is called Bobby's Little Explorers, which leads me to introduce you to the dog that you've probably seen on the slide so far. He's called Bobby, and he is our mascot, and he is on a lot of the material that we issue to the children. We've also developed a storybook which is called Bobby's Big Day Out, and that's just to support parents and children to understand a little bit more about what it's like to come to hospital. What I must stress is that we have used Bobby in a lot of our material, but we haven't overlooked the fact that sometimes the use of a mascot or a dog can be challenging for some people, and we have used different easy read versions, and we've also used symbols in collaboration with our speech and language therapist colleagues as well, to make sure that the information that we are creating and disseminating is accessible to all. As we move forward, what we are looking to do now is really drive home prevention of sensory processing differences. So that is also going to be looking at bringing on board a new member of staff to work in our neonatal department with children who are born early. We are looking to further develop our website. Our information currently is not necessarily as accessible as it could or should be to the wider public, so we're looking to develop that. We're hoping to have some video footage of people accessing our hospital to use as a training resource to demonstrate the challenges that can be experienced by people who attend our hospital. And the one that we've used as an example would be the Can You Make It to the End by the National Autistic Society. Something along those lines is what we're hoping to produce and share with the wider public. We're gathering feedback from the ward-based groups as well to see how well they are going and how well they've been received. And we continue to deliver our sensational training sessions, which offers an overview of sensory processing. And we're also looking at environmental adaptations and a sensory garden. I would like to thank you very much for your time and your interest in the Sensational Thinking project today. I shall now hand over to the chair of the session, who will introduce the next panel presentation. Please, if you could save any questions until the end of today's session, where I will gladly answer them live in the question and answer session. Thank you so much for your time and interest.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was absolutely incredible. I loved hearing all about the Sensational Thinking project and its unique and innovative ways of discovering how we can better meet the needs of children with sensory processing differences. Especially found it fascinating that pre-COVID, you were in 75% of schools in Newcastle. So that's just so impressive, and also loved the recognition that everyone has different needs. So to treat everyone coming in as an individual. So thank you again, Cheryl. So we're going to move on to this session's final presentation before we head into our Q&A session. So here we have George. So here we go, over to you, George. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you to Autistica for inviting me to present today. My name is George Tackley, and I'm a researcher at Cardiff University's Brain Imaging Centre, or KUBRIC, and I undertake work looking at sensory processing, and I have a particular interest in pain and other related phenomena such as itch. So my talk today is called The Self-Reported Experience of Itch in Autistic Individuals. It's not going to be an imaging related talk, but it's actually the result of a multinational online survey of itch in autistic and non-autistic adults. This is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to give a brief background about what we know about itch in autism. I'm going to talk about what we did, discuss our findings, summarise this, and then talk about the next steps. So what do we know about itch in autism? Well, in 2013, in line with contemporary research findings of atypical sensory experiences, the DSM-5 diagnostic manual added behavioural responses to sensory input to their diagnostic criteria. And amongst other things, that included pain, textures, and touch. Pain experience is now well recognised to differ between autistic and non-autistic adults, and ongoing work is looking at this, but itch, which is very closely related to pain, has been left nearly completely unexplored. And given the broad sensory landscape described above, we thought it was worth looking at. Although itch itself is almost completely absent from published research, there are descriptions of similar and perhaps overlapping phenomena. One of them is hyper-responsiveness to touch and textures, and in a couple of published accounts this has been labelled as itch. However, no structured research or symptom management activity is focused on understanding the experience of itch in autism. So what did we do? Well, we conducted a multinational, that was between the UK and Australia, online survey of itch experience in autistic and non-autistic adults. And this was co-produced with autistic adults and loosely based on an already published itch scale used in dermatology called the 5D itch scale. The reason was to explore the experience of itch and to have a think about existing management strategies. And our prediction was that itch experience, like it is with pain experience in autism, would be atypical, again similar to other tactile sensations. The online questionnaire asked demographic questions, including age, sex registered at birth, and location they were living at when they completed the questionnaire. It also included questions about the types of itch that they might experience. So spontaneous itch, itch that arises for no reason; provoked itch, itch that may be provoked by touch or the contact of material against their skin; and medical types of itch, so things that were diagnosed that might be expected to cause itch. We also included 2 standardised questionnaires: the short autism quotient, the AQ10, and the Glasgow sensory questionnaire. When someone identified that they had an itch, we then went into more details with a standardised battery of questions, asking about the frequency of that itch, how severe it was, its impact on various things, including sleep, where it is on their body, any factors that might make it better or worse, any management strategies they have, and questions about the length that itch has been there and the timing of it. In the talk today, I'm going to talk in detail about the first 3, which we've started to analyse. I'm going to allude to the second group of 3 there, which we have some provisional data from, but I won't be talking about the last 2. So as part of the questionnaire, we asked people to self-categorise as to whether they were autistic, and these will be referred to as yes for the rest of the presentation, whether they were not autistic but suspected they might be so, and these will be categorised as no suspect for the rest of the presentation, or not autistic, and these will be categorised as no throughout. And you can see the relative numbers of respondents for each of those groups. The total number was 280 that responded. In terms of where they were from, 208 came from the UK. Most of those were in the yes group. 58 came from Australia. The majority of those were in the no group. And we had a few respondents from other parts of the globe. Ages were similar across autism categories, at just over 40 years old. There were more females than males that responded, but again, these were not significantly different between autism categories. The AQ10 and GSQ scores were significantly different across categories, and if you think of the AQ10 as having a cutoff of 6 or greater being suggestive of autism, then the results are probably as you'd expect. These charts show the percentage of people in each of the autism categories that suffer from particular types of itch. So the first chart that's appeared there is spontaneous itch. The one that's appeared now is provoked itch, and the chart for medical itch has just come up. The first thing to note is that itch in general is very common. Looking at spontaneous itch, more than 60% of all people assessed reported spontaneous itch of some sort. The second thing to note is that actually there were greater numbers of those in the autism categories than those in the no autism categories across the board, and this was significant for spontaneous and provoked itch. Those with medical itch, the commonest types of medical itch that were reported were eczema and dermatitis, dandruff and dry skin. And as part of the provoked itch, we looked at different categories of this and looked at material provoked itch, itch when someone comes into contact with objects, and itch when touched by another person. And again, you can see a very similar pattern across the board here. And actually, from now on, I'm going to focus exclusively on spontaneous itch and material provoked itch, as these were the largest groups, and actually the same sort of pattern was found for all of the data with objects and people. So what about itch severity? Well, the plot that's come up here shows the itch severity for spontaneous itch, and again it's divided by autistic group, and it shows the spread of severity from no itch at all to very severe itch, and the coloured outline shows that graphically represents this spread, and you can see that for those with autism, more are reporting very severe, severe and moderate itch compared to those without, and this is a statistically significant difference, and the pattern is very similar to those with provoked itch, where again there is a significant difference when we test it significantly. So we've seen that itch is reported more commonly and more severely in autistic people. But what about the impact of this itch on everyday activities? So the first thing we asked about was sleep, and we asked people to select a rating, and the ratings are displayed here, and so that ranges between never affecting sleep up to the top, which is delayed falling asleep and frequently waking them up at night. And if we look at the results for spontaneous itch and provoked itch, you can see a pattern that's similar across both types. And if you look at these, you can see that greater than 50% of autistic people have itch that interferes with sleep. And a non-trivial number of these have itch that delays falling asleep and wakes them at night. A similar question was asked about the impact of itch on work. The ratings for these are slightly different, and so these range from never affects this activity up until always affects this activity. And again, for spontaneous and provoked itch, we see a similar pattern of result. Greater than 50% of autistic people have itch that affects their work, and again, a non-trivial number of these have itch that always affects their work. And for leisure, the same rating scale is used, and a very similar pattern of results is again found. And I think this serves to highlight that the data I presented earlier, i.e. more itch at a greater severity in autistic versus non-autistic people, is not just a matter of differences in reporting styles, but reflects a meaningful difference in itch experience that impacts autistic people's everyday lives. So the last couple of slides are just a preview of some of the other data that we've been collected. The first is looking at where people experience itch, and so this is the example for spontaneous itch, and again divided by autism category. You can see that people locate spontaneous itch in perhaps slightly different areas dependent on the autism category they sit under. We also provided a lot of free text response boxes. This means we now have a very rich qualitative data set. Again, this is yet to be analysed, and this word cloud here is just an example, again thinking about spontaneous itch and asking people what made their spontaneous itch worse, and this is just for those with autism. We also collected data on management strategies. Again, there's a free text exercise, and again this has not been analysed. And the sorts of things that people mentioned range from avoiding certain fabrics, using antihistamines, to things like meditation and using cooling stimuli. One example would be having a cold shower. In summary then, itch in autistic adults can be severe and can impact on daily activities such as work, leisure and sleep. Both spontaneous itch and provoked itch are experienced more often and at greater severity in autistic versus non-autistic adults. Some autistic people have developed strategies for coping with itch, and we tried to explore some of these. And these strategies could be shared with the wider population. As well as completing the full analysis of the rich dataset I've presented some of today, our proposed next steps include exploring how autistic subjective self-report might map onto objective physiological measures of itch. We also want to explore the experience of itch for those we are unable to reach using an online questionnaire, so this might include groups such as children. And an outcome from all of this will be to co-produce an evidence-based booklet describing the autistic experience of itch, and including management strategies. I'd like to thank those who participated in my research. Thanks to my collaborators listed here, and to my funders, and to my autistic co-producers. I'll leave you with a couple of quotes before handing you back to the session chair. Please save any questions you have for the Q&A session at the end of the talks.
Thank you so much, George, for that fascinating presentation. It was incredible to hear about the types and features of itch experience in autistic and non-autistic people, and the multitude of impacts it can have in areas of such as work, sleep and leisure. So we are now going to be moving on to our Q&A section of the session. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome our speakers back to the webinar. Hi, George. Hi, Cheryl.
Hello.
Lovely to see you both. Oh, and we've also got Keren. Hi, Keren. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
Fabulous. And Emily, thank you as well for being here. I know, Emily, you're going to keep your camera off, so no worries at all about that. Well, brilliant. What a treat to have everybody here. Thank you so much for giving us your time and also for sharing such wonderful presentations. I feel like I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience feels the same. So we've had a wealth of questions flooding in from our wonderful audience members. So George, as you were just up, I might begin with you if that's okay.
Go for it. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. So first question for you, why do you think research into itch experience has been slow to emerge?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good question. Yeah. And I guess there's sort of potentially two answers to that. I think one of the answers, and I think probably what my gut feeling is that I think probably itch has always been an issue, as far as I can tell from the data that we're collecting, but actually it may have been described in other terms. And one of the things I alluded to in the presentation was about tactile defensiveness, and you know, the very, very common reports, people wanting to remove clothing labels and things like that. You know, whether people just haven't been given the vocabulary to be able to describe it as itch, and it's just been described as tactile defensiveness or irritability, might be why itch has not come up as a problem as of yet. I guess the other possible answer is that by sending out a questionnaire asking about itch, I'm sort of pushing people into that category as well, and that's something we've got to be cautious of. That we're not saying, okay, you've got all these other symptoms, these other sensations, but you can describe them as itch if you like, but actually maybe they're not itch. And so it's something that came up from some of the free text answers that we had as well, that, you know, a lot of people were really buying into the fact that it's itch and would describe it as itch quite happily, and you know, really give some quite detailed accounts of their itch sensations. But then there were a couple, just two or three sort of reports that would say, you know, I have this itch, but I wouldn't necessarily describe it as itch. So there is definitely some nuance to work out there as well. So I hope that helps answer.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. And I suppose it's interesting to know what people do when they are given this terminology and how they respond to that, and if it's something that they can then accept or perhaps something that they can react against. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. Another question for you, George. So do you think that there was any association with symptoms of stress or anxiety, and did that provoke a spontaneous itch or other forms of itch perhaps?
Yeah, again, sort of two parts to this. I mean, my first answer would be absolutely yes. Again, from the free text answers that we got, a lot of people reported an association, and you saw in that word cloud towards the end, an association between having itch sensations and being in an anxious state, and often those two things seem to come together in the free text answers. I guess the second answer is that we didn't formally assess that as part of this piece of research. There weren't any anxiety levels or scales that we sent out as part of this online questionnaire, so we can't sort of give you a tight and quantitative answer about that, but it's something that we're definitely hoping to look into a little bit more.
So let's move on to lovely Keren and Emily. So we've had some really interesting questions coming in for you both. So first up, at the start, you gave some examples of public spaces that autistic people often struggle with. So how do you think the principles you identified can be applied to make these places more enabling?
Yeah, I'll just say something then briefly on the research side, and Emily can talk about it from a different perspective. So yeah, I think as part of the research that we did, which we didn't talk about because it's quite extensive, is we also did a case study analysis on each of the disabling environments. So kind of in the supplementary materials of the paper, there's very specific examples from the participants as to like the more like in those environments in the context ways that places can actually be improved, and we were kind of mapping on and evidencing those principles in each of the different places. So for example, in like supermarkets, it was talking about how obviously like a lot of the sensory environment is unavoidable, but things like the quiet hours are actually really beneficial, but they're not always accessible or at good times, or not all places do them, and things like that. So yeah, we have kind of taken some steps to be able to look at how those are evidenced. I just wonder if Emily's got anything to talk about as part of that.
Yeah, no, I definitely back up what you're saying. Yeah, I'm not really sure how much more I can add to that. I think it's just, yeah, understanding how like disabling these environments can be, and I really think like as a team, our researchers like done really well to kind of delve into that. So yeah.
Amazing, thank you both so much. So we've got a couple more questions for you both. So a nice quick and easy one. So where are your results being shared, and are changes being adopted as far as you're aware?
Yes, our results are being shared all over the place, actually, aren't they, Emily? We have the website, as was mentioned at the end. We've got a research paper, which is obviously more formal. The website has lots of kind of information, like basically the results of the study, but just written in a more like accessible way, which is really, really good. Emily, do you want to talk more about your work and the podcast and stuff as well?
Yeah, I've just kind of been like helping with the branding and stuff of Sensory Street, and like Keren said, the website is really accessible. So I find like for me with like processing issues, a lot of research is really hard to read and isn't very easily understood. But with ours, I feel like Keren said, it's kind of much more kind of clearer, and it's really easy to understand and is very accessible. Yeah, I've just kind of like done lots of like visuals and things, because I just think they're much easier to understand and process, and to me it really helps, and I know a lot of autistic people really find visuals very helpful. So yeah, hopefully like the research comes across as like a bit of like both. It's quite visual as well as like in-depth.
Okay, so we've got, let me see, yeah, we have got a nice juicy one for Keren and Emily here. So it was very interesting work on environments and factors that can increase sensory demand or be more enabling for autistic people. From this research, can you suggest some recommendations for how to extend these adjustments to autistic people who speak few to no words to reduce stress and anxiety in environments?
Yes, so obviously that's not something that we went into for this specific project, but we really, really recognise the importance of that, obviously, and examining in lots of different types of people. I think that a lot of the things that we identified would go across like different groups of people and people with different levels of needs. But the future work that we're thinking of doing and kind of taking this forward and looking more practically into doing research as to how to work with environments to actually change them and improve them, that will be when there'll be a more extensive, hopefully, process with different groups of people to make sure that their experiences are also included, and to work out if the changes, potential changes that we've found, if that they do work across populations or if they don't. So yeah, it's a very good question, and not something I have answers to at the moment, but
That's quite all right.
That's fine. Emily, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we almost can't answer it yet, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. You both gave it an excellent shot there. I'm just going to see if any other questions have come in for you both. Whilst we're beavering away in the background to get Cheryl's audio problems sorted. Okay, yeah, we have a good one here. So, what are the best ways to communicate to the public about neurodivergent sensory experiences and the impact of environment? So what have you had success with, and what would you like to see emulated?
I mean, I think Emily's best place to answer about communicating sensory processing, because that's what she does so well. So
Amazing.
Not to put you on the spot.
It's really tricky because obviously it's something that's not very visible, and it can be really hard to communicate, like say if I'm struggling in a supermarket or something like that. So it is quite a big question, and I think that's one of the reasons why I do make like a lot of visuals, because it is really hard to verbalize like this, all the different sensory things, and you can have good sensory days, bad sensory days. So it is really kind of tricky to kind of sum it up. I don't know if you want to repeat the question, because I'm trying to think like if I've answered it.
Absolutely. So what are the best ways to communicate to the public about neurodivergent sensory experiences and the impact of environment?
I think it's really important to just, be willing to have like a conversation and be willing to ask. Like, I have no problems if someone wants to ask me about like my sensory issues, or I say this a lot, instead of asking me if I'm okay, maybe be more direct and say, are you struggling in this environment, or would you like to go outside? Like, if you ask me if I'm okay in a very overwhelming environment, I'll say I'm fine. So it's almost like also the language you use as well, as to like what response you'll get from me and potentially other people with sensory issues. So yeah, it's not just kind of asking them, but also being aware of your own language as well.
Amazing. I think that's such a wonderfully concrete example that you've given there. Instead of asking if you're okay, look at how the environment's impacting you. That's wonderful. Well, thank you both. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, the wizards of technology have come back on our side, and that we may now be able to hear from Cheryl.
Can you hear me now?
Success! Yay, we can.
Panic over.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your patience, Cheryl. Sorry about those difficulties. So we've got a flood of practical plethora of questions for you. So let me just get them up. So number one, so this was the one that we began with earlier. So let's kick off again here. So what would you recommend for consistency of training across services? And is there a better way that we can support autistic people and their families in terms of their pre-experience hospital environments?
Okay, sorry. So I have to write things down. I'm dyslexic and I really struggle with remembering. Jotted it down. So with regards to the consistency of training, I think what we'd really love is for the Sensational Thinking project to be extended beyond Newcastle hospitals. And we are working in collaboration with Alder here, which I obviously made reference to in the presentation. And the hope is that that information can be disseminated, I guess, nationally, to be honest with you, because, we are a very large hospital and we get patients basically from all over the country, and sometimes from, other countries, to be honest. And I think having that uniform standard approach would be the right way, especially from a training perspective, and then everyone's getting that same consistent message, which is really good for patient experience. With regards to the preemptive work, for either pre-admission or with regards to maybe say outpatients, I think one of the most important things to remember is that everyone's different, and I mean that as in on a daily basis. So our hospital, like a lot of hospitals, have got the patient passport or hospital passport, which is, I think, an okay document. But one of my problems is, particularly for somebody who's considering sensory processing, we need to remember from on a day-to-day basis what somebody has been through. So what we're trialing on Ward 8, which is our day
case unit. If anybody saw the Geordie Hospital, you'll have seen Ward 8 to come on for a day. And what we're hoping to do is have a virtual pre-admission assessment, but also have conversations maybe the day before. And I think probably what we will also do is extend that to maybe even a written or a virtual document for the journey here, so that we have that communication all of the way through to make sure their needs can be met regardless of what stage they're at, if that makes sense.
That's perfect. Thank you for such a full answer there. That's wonderful. Now I will move us on to the next one. So please let me know if I can repeat this for you at all, Cheryl. I'm conscious that you're writing things down. Response from the audience here. So great to hear of such innovation within hospitals. What advice would you offer to professionals at other hospitals wanting to implement change?
Okay, that's an easy one.
Oh, good.
But I think one of the most important things is know your patients is probably the thing that I would say. We're working really intensively, although I'm really keen to get as much information from people here today with regards to gathering information as to what is your patient's experience of your environment, because I think from a sensory processing perspective, your environment impacts dramatically on your ability to participate. And I think it's really important that everybody recognises what I guess facilitates occupation within, or facilitates function within the hospital, but actually what can actually inhibit participation as well. So that would probably be my primary starting place with regards to that. Gather that information, work collaboratively, but again, our hope is, because our work's funded by NHS England, I'm very keen to try and roll this out nationally and work across the board. It's like I say, anyone can go to any one hospital. We've got Bobby there, that way it's a recognizable character, and I appreciate not everybody likes dogs, not everybody wants that, but having a symbol, and I'm open to even what that symbol is, but in Newcastle hospitals, anyone who sees that now recognizes that is a symbol of sort of a safe place for anybody experiencing sensory processing difficulties. And I think having that standardized approach and that simple visible tool is helpful. I know just briefly there, Emily mentioned when somebody asks, not just are you okay, but actually is asking a much more open question as well, to be mindful that some people who are in sensory overload don't want anyone to see anything. So having things in picture format is so very important, so that we keep all channels of communication open to everybody.
Absolutely, thank you. That's a brilliant answer. So let me just see what else we have coming up for you, Cheryl. Right, we've got a good one here. So professionals must understand sensory needs without making an assumption that all autistic people are the same, which I think is something that we've seen echoed across everybody's presentations today. So we know it's clearly not true. All autistic people are not the same. So how do you think that we can achieve this? How do you think that we can achieve that understanding from professionals around sensory needs that might be, they might have similar needs from patient to patient, but how can we make that understanding apparent that everybody has different needs?
Oh, that is probably one of the things that I struggle with most of all when I'm doing my presentations to staff. We talk a lot around, that dreadful term behaviors. I much prefer to think about responses. If somebody's having a response, whether it be verbally or behaviorally, it is a response to something that is not a pleasant experience for that person. I think probably one of the most important things is to do exactly what I mentioned at the beginning, is to information gather on an individualized basis, not to treat everybody the same, but most importantly, gather that information, I guess, preemptively, like we've just touched on with regard to that last bit of information. And I guess for what we're really keen for is that the sensational thinking becomes part of our trust's mandatory training. And the reason I'm really keen for that is to safeguard our patients with regards to experience, but also our staff. It's like I mentioned in my bio, I'm the chair of the Disability Staff Network, and we have so many members of staff who come forward and talk about their experience as a neurodivergent member of staff, and actually the environment's not conducive for their needs. So I just think if we can safeguard our patients, we can also safeguard our staff. And I think if we all have that, greater understanding as to what the needs may be, but also having a link person. So rather than just assuming, actually, is it that we've got like learning disabilities nurses, experts in that field? Is it that we have a few people within our trust, maybe the likes of me and some of the other sensory trainers trained members of staff, where they can be contacted and maybe assessments can be made if necessary. But primarily the starting point is talk to your patients and the families and gather that information.
I love that. It's such a pure and simple concept, isn't it? Have the patients at the heart, have that communication with them. But it's so difficult sometimes to translate that. I understand. Well, thank you. That was wonderful. And I'm so glad we were able to have your audio sorted. We've got time for just one more question, and this is coming for George, if that's okay. So a question here. So does your itch have to be external? My brain itches when I'm challenged by sensory overload in certain environments, like conference spaces with weirdly patterned carpets that have been cleaned with solutions I can still smell. So I guess this is a question on how can we classify itch, and does it have to be an external classification?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think it sort of goes back to a little bit what I was talking about before, is sort of how we're defining itch and what we mean when we use the term itch. I don't have an answer to your question. I think often itch is something that we associate with a sensation on the skin, but I don't see any reason why some people couldn't conceptualize it as something internal. I think what we need to do is explore it further, and I think one of the things that we hope to do next is make the investigation of itch a little bit more open, a little bit more qualitative in the first instance, so that we get some really rich descriptions of what autistic people are experiencing when they are happy to describe it as itch. And I think we'll have to take it from there. But it may well be that other people experience an itch that is also, they also feel is internal rather than something that they can assign to an area of skin.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, this has been just wonderful. Honestly, thank you all so much for giving such fantastic presentations, for being here to share your wisdom and insights. I feel very inspired, to be honest, and I'm sure a lot of our audience members do as well. But it remains for me to say thank you so much again to our wonderful speakers, to our audience for watching and taking part with your brilliant questions. Everybody's email addresses will be put into the Q&A system now if you would like to ask them any further questions. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining the session. So this is day one of Austica's Research Festival. So we'll be back again tomorrow for our next session starting at 11 AM, and we'll be delighted to see you there. If you can't make it, don't worry at all. All of our sessions are going to be recorded, and we'll be putting them on Austica's YouTube within the next month. So thank you again to Keren, Emily, George and Cheryl. It's been an absolute pleasure. You all take lots of care, and we'll speak again very soon, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.